This is so much fun, and I'm so excited to be here. When I was approached about doing this, and I saw the date range of the conference, and I saw, well, could I give a talk on my birthday? And I was like, do you know what? I absolutely will. So here I am. Hey, everybody. Listen, before we get started, let me just turn on captioning. There we go. Now we can start for real. Yeah, so happy to hear so much. Thank you so much for tuning in to listen to me talk about a topic that's really near and dear to me. Mentorship, I find something to be, something really important. And I'm going to share with you a little bit about why I do it, why I think you should either get into it or get back into it. You've got a link here at the bottom of this slide to my slides if you want to follow along on your device. That's ramonh.dev/mentorship-stories.pdf. So enough waffling on the first slide. Let's get into a little bit about me. Yes, hi, my name's Ramon. My pronouns are he, him. I'm originally from Chile, but I've been living in Austria for a very, very long time. Day to day, I work as a developer advocate at Suborbital. We do serverless cloud compute using WebAssembly, which is a lot of new technologies for me and a lot for fun. I also do developer relations consultancy, lots of Ruby, JavaScript, and Rust, done some Python recently in live streams, which has been a lot of fun. And I just really love tech communities in general. It's such an honor to be able to be here and talk to you a little bit about what I'm doing and share a little bit about what is an important passion of mine, and also to hear back from you. So please do keep in touch. Yeah, so when we talk about mentorship, I'm going to start perhaps a little bit cliched with my side of the story, what my experiences with mentorship are and how I got into it. So, and it all started towards the beginning of my career. I was studying software engineering here in Vienna at the Technical University. And when my wife and I were, well, my girlfriend at the time and I were looking for an apartment to live in, and I was looking for some work to be able to pay the bills, didn't have much experience. So I thought, I'll look for some babysitting job or something or work in retail to help me pay the bills while we do that. And my girlfriend found a job on the internet of somebody looking for a freelance Mac OS X developer, and that'll give you an idea of how long ago it was, because it was still called Mac OS X instead of Mac OS. But anyway, I had very little experience. I had recently purchased my first ever MacBook, but I thought, do you know what? I'm feeling a little bit brave today. I'm going to give it a try. So I sent in my CV, I sent in an application, and I didn't think much of it. And quite quickly, the person who was looking for that developer got back to me and said, hey, Ramon, everything looks great. Let's meet up next Monday. How does that sound? And I thought, well, it's Friday. That's quite soon. I'm not sure I'm ready. You know what? I'll do it. And I went there. We met, just to show you how Viennese this is. We met at the Cafe Mozart in Vienna. I dressed up in a suit for like the third time in my life. Quite nervous. I went there and I met this gentleman called Philip, who was very kind. Turns out we gone to the same school and everything. And he sat me down and he essentially said, Ramon, listen, I took a look at your CV. Everything looks interesting. I saw you were doing some Python as well. That's really cool. I got to ask you, why are you applying for this job? You don't have any practical experience. And I was feeling quite brave at the time. And so I told him, Philip, listen, I think I can learn quickly. I think I can, apply my skills. I've done this university coursework. I think I can do well. I think I can thrive if given a chance. And, I have to be upfront and say I got extremely lucky that he did take that chance in me. And he said, Ramon, here's what I'm going to do. Let's not get you programming yet, but I do need some help with my email support for my macOS apps that I sell. So why don't you do that for a while? Here's a book, and he gave me a recommendation for a book called Cocoa Programming for macOS X by Aaron Hillegas. Fantastic book at the time, and it got me into what I would call my programming career. I don't have the physical copy, which is why I'm showing it to you here. I lent it, and I can't remember to whom. If you're watching this and you have my copy, could you please let me know? Anyway, so I started doing this, and I did some programming with him. And after a few months, he sent me an email, and the subject line, I'm never to this day going to forget. He said, highly pleased with your work. And that meant the world to me. He was pleased with how quickly I was going along, how quickly I was learning, and how I was, being able to apply my newly developed skills to do things like bug fixing and improvements to the apps. And we work together to this day. It's been 12 years. We're still working together. It's marvelous, and it's been an absolute joy for me. But it took me a long time to realize that through all these years, and by doing things like this and giving me advice, Philip has been essentially mentoring me, and to this day is still mentoring me. And that means a lot. That means so much to me, and I think is something that I want to share with you today. And being that this is a conference talk and we need to start with a dictionary definition that I got from the internet, let's define mentorship, shall we? Mentorship is, I'm going to read it out to you. Mentorship is a relationship between two people where the individual with more experience, knowledge, and connections is able to pass along what they have learned to a more junior individual within a certain field. Sounds good. If I were to put this in another way, it's a relationship between two people where one person passes knowledge on to the other and experience and connections. And that connections part is also super interesting to talk about. We'll get into that a little bit later. But I want to expand on that a little bit today. And I want to get into how mentorship, yes, happens one-on-one. But I also want to talk about how when you think of mentorship, you think of two people sitting across each other, having a conversation and passing knowledge one way or the other. But I would like to argue that mentorship is actually kind of happening everywhere in a way. For example, I'm going to show you some examples. Here's a screenshot from an open source contribution I made to a project called the Rails Girl Summer of Code, which, by the way, was an amazing program. Not the topic of today, but a program to help underrepresented folks get into open source development. So it wasn't just for Rails, but it was also for Ruby on Rails, pardon me, but also for all sorts of open source projects, including Python ones. I think Flask was one of them. I could be wrong. Anyway, so I made this GitHub contribution. I made a pull request, and at the bottom of the screenshot, you can see that Klapradla left a comment saying, this looks solid. I've added some small comments here and there. I think it would be a good opportunity. And he essentially walked through my changes and just made suggestions based on what he thought would be a better fit, not just for the code, but for my learning as well. And that, in my opinion, was a form of mentorship. Let's talk about other forms of mentorship. Let's talk about getting together in meetups. This is a picture from the local Vienna Ruby meetup. This picture is, oh my goodness, 2014, 8 years old. My goodness. I'm actually in this picture as well. You can see that's me looking quite interestedly at the topics being told. And, if you're not familiar with them, meetups are, occasions where folks get together to talk with one another, but also to give short presentations on the knowledge that they've gathered on certain topics or, share experiences. And I find that this in its own way is a form of mentorship. We get together, we have conversations, we ask questions of one another, we break out into smaller conversations, and I find that this is extremely fruitful. But it doesn't just have to be that way. Mentorship can be a little bit more formalized in that way, a little bit more Python related. This picture you see here, it's in the same place but from a different day. This was a PyLadies Flask introduction workshop that we did, that we helped organize. And again, super fun, motivated folks coming in to learn about not just Python and Flask, but also, the fundamentals of web development. And we would get together. Myself, I volunteered as a coach to be able to come in and give advice, pass my knowledge and solve problems. And I find that this is a really fundamental way to express that mentorship. But it doesn't have to just be between adults. For example, it could be with younger folks. Here, this picture you share here. All of these pictures, by the way, I'm sharing with permission, just FYI. This is a picture from an after-school activity that my wife and I used to run, computer game programming, where the kids would get together and we would teach them programming and we would have a lot of fun. We would make games, as the name explains, but we also did stuff with Sonic Pi. I don't know if you're familiar with it. This is a runtime that allows folks to be able to programmatically make music. Super fun. The kids love it. One recommendation, if you ever do something like this, give them headphones, because if they're doing it through the speakers and you've got like 30 sets of music playing at the same time, it can cause a headache or two. But anyway, it was super fun and allowed me to be able to express my knowledge the same way. But again, it doesn't just happen, on the web. It doesn't just happen, in person, but it can be a combination of the two. For example, I would used to do when we used to be able to do the Rails Girls Summer of Code. I could get together with folks from all around the world and be able to mentor, to coach, to pass on knowledge. For example, I'm going to go clockwise. Top left, we've got folks in Medellin in Colombia. We've got top right, we've got folks in India. We've got at the bottom folks in Europe. It's just all over the world, and kind of a magical bonding experience. But even though we're in tech, mentorship isn't just confined to the tech itself. I would argue that mentorship can go beyond that. This is a picture from one of my favorite events in the world. It's called the Global Diversity CFP Day, which is an event that takes place all around the world to help especially underrepresented folks get into conference speaking, public speaking, like I'm doing with you today. CFP being short for Call for Proposals. And so we'd get together and have activities and workshops to be able to beat that, to be able to start, applying to and giving conference talks or meetup talks or, online talks like I'm doing right now. So those are some forms that mentorship takes, but you might be wondering, okay, why be a mentor then? Because it is a lot of responsibility, and it's, I would argue, quite different from teaching. So what I'm about to go through here is much better explained by my friend Geddes in his book, the Mentorship Guidebook. Fantastic resource. So I'm going to cover what he says here and try to put my own spin on it, if I may, because the one group of folks that mentorship helps is, of course, helping others, being able to help folks with their career, their education, help them beat their imposter syndrome. We'll get into imposter syndrome a little later, and help them with their projects in general. But I would also argue that mentorship, and Geddes does too, that it helps you as the mentor. It helps you learn more about yourself. It helps you expand your worldview, make new friends, allies. It helps you support folks. It helps you, on a bit more of a selfish side, it helps you feel good about giving back. And I find that explaining things helps you find knowledge gaps in your own thinking and to learn something new. What I'm getting at here is that mentorship isn't, in my opinion, just for experts. If you've done some learning, you can absolutely help mentor somebody who's learning behind you and help pass on your knowledge and your experiences. I'll cover that a little bit later as well. But there's a third group of people that I find is helped by mentorship, and it's all of us as a community. If we help mentor each other, if we help connect each other, we encourage each other to be more collaborative. We make inclusivity happen, which is critical to the thriving of a tech and most other communities. So I kind of touched on it briefly, but I want to come back and make that distinction again, personal opinion, on mentoring versus teaching. Because when you think of teaching, right, you think of a sort of classroom environment where a teacher teaches to students. You've got a one-way flow of knowledge. But with mentoring, I would argue it kind of goes both ways, right? You've got, the mentor and the mentee, having open conversations and learning from one another. This can absolutely happen. So what I'm going to do next is I'm just going to cover with you folks some pieces of advice that I've picked up over the years in how to be a good mentor. And if I don't cover everything, folks, I would love to hear from you. So please do keep in touch. So my first one is the opening. I find that setting expectations right from the get-go is really important to a good mentor-mentee relationship, and to absolutely open with a question. Hey, what are you hoping to get out of this mentor-mentee relationship? And here's something else. Once you've established that and you start working towards those goals, do you know what happens? I'm sure it's happened to all of us. With time, those goals change. So I think it's important to every now and then just be like, hey, I know you wanted to, eventually do some keynote speaking. Is that something you still want to do? And just check in and see where those goalposts change to. And by having these open conversations, I feel that transitions into my next point quite well, which is how important it is as mentor and mentors to encourage those good habits. And I would even argue to say that by mentoring, we're already encouraging the good habit of being able to, show folks our learning and being able to explain those. But I'll get into those in just a moment, because how important it is to bear in mind that mentorship carries on beyond, even if it's a one-time half-hour conversation that you have with your mentee and you never speak again, or you don't check in for many years or, however long time. By taking the time to mentor that person, you are still making an impression that carries on over to the next relationship that that mentee has with another mentor or with their respective mentees. Because of course, in a way, you're not just mentoring your mentee, but you're also passing on your knowledge through that mentee to that mentee's mentees. You know what I mean? So it kind of has a long-lasting, almost domino effect that I find really important to bear in mind. And by already having these conversations, I think it's really important to bear in mind we are demonstrating our empathy as human beings. Mentorship requires that empathy to sort of put yourself into the shoes of your mentee, because there are going to be perspective gaps that form over time with experience, where you kind of go like, oh yeah, I forgot what it was like, for example, to not understand how to do a recursive function, or to how to grok recursion in general, or understand complex programmatic concepts. And by doing this, I think we also encourage this really important effective communication. One of our most important skill sets as programmers, beyond coding, is that of communication. I spent a lot of time a long time as a freelancer myself, as you saw in my story, and for me, one of my most important things was to be able to communicate with my clients and say like, hey, this is why this will take this such and such much time, and how important it is, even when doing things like code reviews or opening pull requests, how important it is to be clear and thoughtful and strategic about what it is that we're trying to tell our colleagues. Excuse me for a sec. And I find that I find that a good way to be able to do that for our mentees is to have those open conversations and encourage them to ask those challenging but also narrowed questions. Have you ever had a relationship with a mentee where they would come in and say like, hey, I want to get into coding. What's the best programming language I should learn? And I know what you're all thinking, because I've thought this too. And it always feels a little bit bad to open your answer with, well, it depends. So why not try and encourage your mentee to sort of narrow that question down? For example, which programming language should I learn first if I want to work as a web developer? Which is better? It helps you get some ideas. Well, you can totally learn Python. You can totally learn JavaScript. You can totally learn, whichever other language you think is good. The right tool for the job. But I think there's that can even be narrowed down a little further and say, not which programming language should I learn first, but what's a good programming language to learn first, and encouraging your mentee to sort of break that down and be like, okay, I understand what it is that my requirements are for this context. And by doing so, I feel like you can do what's my next piece of advice, which is to expose rather than impose what you think is best. Now, I have found this with my experience, and I'm sure some of you have found this as well. As we get experience, programmers tend to become opinionated. They find the tools, tools that work for them, and they get attached to them. And so they want to be like, oh, no, you should use, oh my goodness, I can't think. You should use Django rather than Flask for all cases, for example, right? And we have those opinions, but I find that it's really important to show not impose those opinions on my mentee, but rather expose why they work for me. Show them why it is that I prefer to use Vim, for example. Why it is that I like to use Rust or Ruby or Python. Why it is, for example, if we're talking about JavaScript, right, that I prefer to put the curly bracket on the same line as the if statement rather than below it. Why it is that I prefer to do my streaming and conference talks on a Mac rather than a PC. Why it is that I like to have two screens so that I can have my speaker's notes here and my slides here. Why it is that, for example, I can have a website oriented in portrait, for example, and all these other things. Why it is that I like to use what are they called? Oh my goodness, what's that Git style called that I completely forgot? Conventional commits. Sorry, folks. small brain shutdown there. Yeah, why it is that I prefer to use conventional commits for my work. And by exposing them and showing that there's, it's not that this is the best tool, but this is the tool that works best for you for the job. You're not telling your mentee, hey, what you're doing is wrong. You're telling them, this is what works best for me, and it might work well for you too. And by doing so, we get to be supportive. Let's go back to imposter syndrome. I mentioned that briefly at the beginning. And if you're not familiar with the concept, imposter syndrome is a phenomenon that happens to most, if not all people, where they get into a job situation, especially towards the beginning of their careers, and they say to themselves, oh, wait, I'm not sure I belong. I think I lied and cheated my way into becoming a programmer because I don't know how to do X, Y, or Z. And I gotta be honest with you all, this happens to me to this day. The thing is, with experience, I found that my imposter syndrome didn't really go away as much as I developed a set of tools to be able to cope with it, right? So I tell my mentee, listen, it's not that I don't have imposter syndrome. It's just that I've kind of started to accept the fact that sometimes I'm going to be stuck. Sometimes I'm going to be uncomfortable. Sometimes I'm going to need to ask for help. I hate asking for help. It's something I'm working on myself. It's not that asking for help is bad, mind you. It's just that I'm working on it. I'm human. And how important it is to also, when giving this advice, also ground it and tell your mentee, hey, just bear in mind, this is what worked for me at that time. Because experiences change, perspectives change, contexts change depend from person to person. We'll get to that in just a second. I really want to touch upon how important it is to give constructive feedback when being supportive for your mentee. I hope this hasn't happened to any of you, but when you get a negative piece of feedback for your work, how destructive that can be, especially towards the beginning of your career, and how that can absolutely set off that imposter syndrome, and how important it is when we find a piece of code or when we find a piece of work that we know can be improved or we think can be improved. I've discovered a tool and I found that it has a name, and that's called guided questions. And it's something I want to cover briefly. And if you're not familiar with them, these are questions that lead into a discussion with critical thought involved. Now, here comes my one of two slides with code on it, and it is Ruby, but it serves the same purpose. So bear with me, please. So what you see here is a piece of HTML with ERB or embedded Ruby, right? And I got this in a code review from my mentee, where they had, they were translating the string on week and putting in the week number of a date, right? And here's what we're doing here is we're taking that string for that translation, adding an empty string with a space in it, and adding that week number. Now, whenever I see something like this without string interpolation, especially in Ruby, I kind of go like, nah, that's a bit of a code smell. But instead of saying that that's a code smell, that this is like something that could go wrong in the future, I try to think of a way that I could initiate this conversation with my mentee. So I asked my mentee, hey, what happens in a language where the week number is in the middle of the sentence? And my mentee said, well, they said, oh, hold on, the week number is going to be at the end of the string every time. And I said, well, how do you think we can solve this? So we went on a journey together to find out what it is that we could do. And they found the answer, where what you can do is have the translation for the string and pass in that week number as a variable into that localization, so that the translation of the string can decide and interpolate where that week number will go. And they found that on their own, just with my guide, with my question and us having a conversation about it. And that was a much better experience, and gave my mentee one of what is for me one of the most important currencies when learning to code, which is the aha moment. They came to that conclusion on their own, and we were able to, solve. And they were able to solve this on their own, which was fantastic. But when it comes to grounding yourself in your and putting yourself in the shoes of other, I think it's important to bear in mind how important it is to maximize help and minimize harm. There's a blog post that I'm putting into my show notes here, from Will Larson, called "Mentoring from Privilege." That is something I want to touch on really briefly. To how important it is to invest into understanding my privilege as a cis white man, and to not give advice about things that I don't know about. How tempting it is for me as the mentor in my elevated position to be like, yes, I can give you advice on something that I have no idea about. And, to have, for example, myself, I don't have a helpful perspective in how to break into the technology industry, having a master's degree. I don't have a bachelor or a master's degree myself, so I declined to give advice on it. In these cases, offering alternative avenues and people in my network, connecting them and saying, hey, this is someone that I think has a similar lived experience to you, of course with their permission, and say maybe you would be better off talking to them about this topic. This is where our networking and leveraging our network comes really handy. By being a good example as someone with my privilege and with my level of privileges and explicitly calling out harmful behaviors and making at least the best example that I can as a human being. Also incorporating those counterpoint stories to balance them out, again, with the permission of others. And as I said, leverage that network, I think is something really important to bear in mind when doing mentorship. Let's talk about how important it is, not just from being supportive, but also from being attentive. Whenever I'm mentoring, I like to think of myself as an on-demand rubber duck. If you're not familiar with the concept, rubber ducky programming is where you have a rubber duck on your desk. I do not have a rubber duck. I usually talk to this. I got this at a toy shop. It's like a half dog, half penguin kind of thing. I love it. Anyway, not important. And how important it is to yes, rubber ducky programming, somebody that you can feel comfortable talking to at any time and expressing where you're stuck in a problem and tell them and let yourself sort of through that come to the conclusion and being able to solve the problem you're trying to solve. So when I'm discussing an idea, when I'm having those guided question conversations with my mentee, and when they start going in a direction that I feel is perhaps not right or something, or I have a differing opinion, how important it is to give them the respect and the space to voice out their thoughts in full. Because one of two things may happen. One, they might come to their own conclusion that they were wrong about it, or most importantly, even if you at the beginning completely 100% disagreed, by listening to them, you came to the conclusion, hey, wait a minute, you're actually onto something. I was wrong. And then you both learn. How magical that is. And that's exactly what mentorship is all about. It's about learning together. I touched briefly when talking about minimizing harm, how important it is to avoid giving advice on topics that you're not familiar with. But it's also expands, in my opinion, into the technical side. I'm going to share a story, but before I do that, I want to show you a tool that I learned when mentoring, which is one of my most important tools. When somebody asks me a question that I don't know the answer to, this tool is answering with, you know what? I don't know. Let's find out. And I'm going to share you an example from my days of teaching, children to code. So again, I'm not a very good illustrator, so this didn't come out quite well, but bear with me, please. So you've got this window here with a game, right? Where we're making games with the kids, and we're drawing a character. That's the gray circle there. And I was teaching the children about coordinate systems. The x-axis is the horizontal axis, and that lets your character move left and right. The y-axis is the vertical axis that lets the character move up and down. And so when both of these values are 0, your character will be displayed at the top left of the window. And the thing about teaching children is they never, ever hesitate to ask a question and call you out. So one of the kids called me out. They said, hey, hold on, Ramon. When I was doing this in math class, this reminds me of graphs in math class. And when we learned that the origin or the 0, 0 coordinate is at the bottom left, how come it's different in programming? And now the thing is, when I used to do these courses, I would sometimes get stressed and I'd just be like, it was super tempting to be like, you know what, it's fine. It's just the way it is. Just accept it as what it is. But took myself a step back and I used my new tool. I said, you know what? I don't know. Let's find out. Excuse me. And what we found out was quite fascinating. And it's because of the way old monitors or TVs worked. You see, this rather chunky looking TV or monitor here is operated by what are called CRT or cathode ray tubes. And the way they would render their images back in the day extremely quickly, faster than the human eye could see, was by going pixel by pixel down, like lines, lines, lines from top to bottom, rendering those pixels from left to right. So the first pixel to be rendered would be the top left one. And that's why it made sense in graphical systems to display them that way. And I've got a clip here from a YouTube video. I'm going to put the YouTube video here as well. So just a heads up, the next slide is an animated GIF of somebody recording the video game Super Mario Brothers at 10,000 frames per second. That is 10,000 images per second. So like super, super slow down. Check it out. So there you can see Super Mario Brothers super duper slowly rendered. You can see it's going like, it's kind of terrifying and beautiful at the same time. I find it mesmerizing. And how important it is that we learn that together, the children and myself. So when somebody asks you a question and you don't know the answer, you know what? Absolutely hop onto your favorite search engine with your mentee and find out how to do the thing. Here's us looking up how to exit Vim, for example. You know, one of my favorite questions I've ever been asked is the question. We were doing a Rails Girls workshop with some of the learners, and one of them asked me, "Hey Ramon, why is it called a div? You know, the HTML element." And I had to stop and laugh because in all the years that I'd been doing, you know, HTML and web development, I never for a second stopped to wonder. I just accepted it. Oh, it's a div. The div. That's the thing that I have too many of in my web app. I'm of course joking. I've gotten better at my HTML. But you know, and we went on a journey. By the way, in case you're curious, it's short for divider, which makes sense. But I find it amazing that I never wondered this. And using those guided questions to help guide the mentee to their answers. And sometimes you got to do that yourself. You got to go on that journey yourself. And how important it is, this is something that I've learned with live streaming, how important it is to show your thinking process. So when I say live streaming, I mean coding while live streaming. How important it is for me to be here talking to you and talking out loud as I show my thought process. This is something that I find to be quite a barrier lowerer, something that lowers the barrier a lot. And showing, you know, I'm a human being, I make mistakes, I don't have all the answers top of mind. And it gives me an opportunity when we get to certain points of a conversation to take a step back and say, hey, do you know what? This looks mystical, this looks magical, but let's demystify it. And every now and then when we're looking at a new concept, say HTTP requests, to just sit down with my mentee for 1 second and be like, hey, you interested in going to a deep dive right now? And I'll take out a piece of paper. Again, I apologize. I'm not a very good artist. But I will draw out a computer, a client, and a server, show the directions that the HTTP request goes in, which direction the response comes back through, and how important that is to just show, you know, demystify the mystical essentially, and give them your resources, the resources that work best for you when you were learning. For example, when I was learning regular expressions, I would give them the link to regex crossword, which is a super fun game for learning to handle regular expressions. I'll put links to all of these in case you're interested. Same goes for if I'm learning CSS selectors. I highly recommend CSS Steiner, a super fun game for learning CSS selectors. When we were doing Flexbox, I would always recommend to them Flexbox Froggy, super fun game for learning how to do Flexbox and CSS. And by doing all of these, and you know, I want to go back to what I was talking about before about how you, if you've been in tech for a while, if you've been learning for a while and you feel like, well, I'd love to get into mentorship, but I've only got like a handful of, you know, a little bit of experience. I really want to push home how important it is to bear in mind that these knowledge and experiences are relative. You have more experience than someone else. You are absolutely able to ground your perspectives and show someone who's even newer than you what it is that you learned, because that perspective of having learned something recently is something that I myself have lost over time. And I'm going to tell you a story to explain that. So my sister, who's also in tech, by the way, she's in DevOps now. She went to a Rails workshop not too far from Vienna in a place called St. Pölten. And she went to that workshop, she attended, she learned how to code, and it was super fun. And a few weeks later, she got a message from one of the organizers and said, hey, listen, we're having another one of these workshops in Linz, which is about an hour by train out of Vienna, in Linz. And they said, hey, do you want to come be a mentor? And she was like, but hold on. I just did this thing like 2 weeks ago. Are you sure? And they're like, listen, you're the one who knows better than anybody than any of us, what it's like to get into tech. at this stage, you in this context, in this day and age. You're the one who had all of those knowledge gaps filled in. You're the one who had those questions that were really good to answer. You have the metaphors that you applied to your learning, super valuable. And so they essentially told her having that experience that's closer to that of a newcomer is super valuable. And conversely, I think that mentoring can absolutely happen at higher seniority levels. Let me explain what I mean. Myself, I've been coding for 12 years. I've been mentoring for ages. But I don't know anything about graphics programming. So even though I would approach, say, a junior developer, but they have some experience in graphics programming, I will absolutely take their mentorship and be like, hey, how do I do this OpenGL stuff? Or how do I do this P5JS stuff? And have them mentor me and teach me best practices for getting into graphics programming. What are the best vector algebra things that I can do? I see I have a lot to learn. So I've been blabbering on for a while. You're probably wondering, okay, this sounds fun. I'm going to go out and do tons of mentorship and all that. But I want to really drive home how important it is to also know our limits. When I started doing this, I had to be very respectful of my limits and know that I'm only effective as I am capable. By which I mean, I've noticed that if I take on too many mentees, not only will I get burnt out, but the quality of my mentorship will start to suffer as well. It'll take a hit. How important it is to set a good example for our mentees to be like, hey, slow down, know your limits, rest, and take care of yourself. How important that is. So those are the tools that I've been using to do mentorship, and I'm sure that y'all have some great ideas. I want to hear about them in our Q&A. Before we go, you might have been listening to me for a while and you might be wondering, okay, great, where can I go to mentor folks? I'm super keen. Where do I go? So I'm going to give you some suggestions. Some might be better, especially bearing in mind that we've been in a pandemic for a long time. But I found that for me, for example, being able to do local mentorship has been really, really helpful by doing the kids things. But there's also loads of organizations. For example, here in Vienna, there's things like the Wien Coda Dojo. There's the Pi Ladies workshops. There's Railsbridge. There's Rustbridge. There's loads of these around the world. There's Outreachy. Have a look and see if there's one that suits your skill set that you can pass your knowledge on as well. One thing that's worked really well for me, especially during the pandemic, is to host open advice calls with people. And what I'll do is I'll just put a tweet, like right now I'm doing it mostly for Spanish speakers, and I'll just I've got a tweet pinned on my Twitter where it'll say like, hey, listen, I'd love to offer free open advice one-on-ones where we can hop on a call and just chat about your career and see, if I can lend some of my I wouldn't call what I have wisdom, but my knowledge, my experience. This was an idea, by the way, passed to me by my good friend Jessica Rose. She's got some resources as well on how to do this, and I'll put those up they're up in my resources as well. But hey, maybe you've got an open source project and you'd love to be able to help pair with somebody and help them, help to hopefully eventually become maintainers of your open source project. I would absolutely recommend tagging your open source issues on GitHub or GitLab or whatever, and just being like, hey, I would love to help pair with you on this. And, by extension, that relationship becomes an ongoing one that then turns into a fellow maintainership. But hey, maybe you're looking for mentorship in your own workplace. Maybe you're looking to do mentorship in your workplace. I would absolutely recommend seeing if your workplace, a lot of larger workplaces especially, will have internal programs for mentorship. And if not, if you're feeling like it, absolutely see if you can recommend creating one. I think that this is really helpful, especially for folks coming into a workplace in a junior position, to be like, hey, this is an inclusive place that helps us grow as developers. That's a good argument for it too. Let's talk about communities of practice. So this is something funny. This is a term that I learned from my friend Joe Nash. And what this is a community where folks, what we would do here in Vienna is we would just get together every 2 weeks and honestly just hack on whatever. Just bring our laptops, maybe put on headphones, just have a cup of coffee, have a chat, and just be together in the same work room and co-work. right? So it's kind of different from a meetup. And I like it because it allows us to split off into smaller groups and be like, oh, do you know what? I've been wanting to learn Rust. Let's do a little bit of Rust in this corner over here. And it's really fun. And I find it also really effective as a way to learn together. And we, like I said, we've got one in Vienna. It's called Study Jams. It's a lot of fun. And I find it a good way to be able to do that. Let's talk about learning in public. I think that by telling folks that you're available and putting your learning online and writing blog posts, making videos, live streaming. I do lots of live streaming, as I said, making videos, blog posts, having conversations with people, joining in conversations online can be really helpful for you to become more comfortable in expressing yourself. And one thing that I've seen a lot of people doing that I wanted to share with you is this thing called digital gardening. Which kind of sounds like a blog in that you just got these digital notes that are interconnected, but it's really more of a garden that you tend to of your knowledge and your pieces of expertise that you've gathered over the years, and just sort of like tend it as a garden to make sure that folks can come in and consume it, and also create that mentor-mentee relationship. If you're curious about reading more about this, I've also recommend this book here by Nadia Egbal called Working in Public, The Making and Maintenance of Open Source Software. I find this a really effective way to also think about how we can apply mentorship to our open source endeavors. So with all of that said, as you could probably tell, I love mentorship, and I would absolutely encourage you to do the same. And if I may be a little bit cheesy, if you don't mind, I would like to expand that definition from the beginning of mentorship, where I think it's not just about sharing knowledge itself or experiences or networking, but I think it's also about sharing the joy of sharing knowledge, how important that is for us to be able to thrive. So that's me for today. Here's my resources that I said. I'll put, these are on my slides as well. I'll put out a tweet. By the way, folks, if you want to DM me, get in touch, maybe you want to try some mentorship. Maybe you want to talk about mentorship. This is my Twitter handle at the top right. It's at Hola Soy Milk. Get in touch. I'd love to hear what you all think about mentorship stuff. And with that, I say thank you so much and enjoy the rest of the conference. Thanks for having me.